In 1986, the Drug Enforcement Administration received a formal legal ruling from its own appointed administrative law judge. The ruling was unambiguous. MDMA did not belong in Schedule Y. The judge found that it had documented therapeutic value, that clinicians had used it safely for years, and that placing it in the most restrictive category in American law was not supported by the evidence. The DEA administrator read the ruling, acknowledged it, and overruled it. MDMA was banned, the research stopped, and the people who might have benefited from 30 more years of therapeutic development waited in silence while the paperwork was filed. What follows is the story of how a molecule synthesized by accident in a German pharmaceutical laboratory in 1912 became the center of the most important and least reported psychiatric research of the 20th century, and how that research was interrupted for nearly 4 decades by a drug war that its own legal apparatus had concluded was unnecessary. The room is quiet. A Tuesday afternoon in 1980, and the light comes through the shuttered window in long pale strips that fall across the carpet without hurry. Outside, a street in Oakland does its ordinary business. In here, there is a chair, a side table with a glass of water, and a woman who has been trying to talk about something for 11 years. She chose the chair herself when she arrived. She chose the position of it, the angle it faced. The therapist offered this small choice, because the session required it. What was about to happen would ask a great deal of her, and it mattered that she understood she had chosen to be here, had chosen the chair, had chosen, ultimately, to try. She had been in therapy before, several therapists over many years, each of them careful and kind. Each time, the conversation reached a certain point, the year she was 19, the apartment, the smell of a particular autumn, and she felt herself go somewhere that was not inside her body anymore. Not faint, not panicked, simply absent. The therapist would ask her a question, and she would hear the words and understand them and feel, from a great distance, that a response was expected of her, and produce one. It was not lying exactly. It was surviving. This therapist had described something different. A compound, he said, carefully and honestly, that some of his colleagues had been using in certain circumstances. Not a hallucinogen, he was clear about that. Not something that would take her anywhere she did not choose to go. Rather, something that appeared to reduce the speed at which the door slammed shut. He said he had seen it work in cases where nothing else had. He said he could not promise her anything, but that, in his experience, the conversation that followed was often the one that had been waiting. She took it at 10 in the morning, sitting in the chair she had chosen, still in her coat. The room was warm. She held the glass of water and did not drink from it immediately, and then, after a few minutes, did. By noon she was talking, not carefully, not with the managed distance she had spent years constructing around that year. She was talking the way people talk when something that has been sealed for a very long time is no longer sealed, not because the lock has been broken, but because someone has finally found the key and placed it in her hand. The therapist wrote in his notebook. He said very little. He asked one question gently around noon, and she answered it with a fullness that surprised her, as if the answer had been sitting just inside her mouth all along, waiting for permission to leave. She was tired by 2 o'clock. Not the desperate tired of depletion, but the clean tired of someone who has carried something a long distance and finally set it down. She had a cup of tea. She looked out the window. The street below looked the same as it always had, and somehow lighter. The compound on the table had no street name yet. No one was dancing to it. No one had written about it in a newspaper. It had not yet been seized, or criminalized, or celebrated, or mourned. It was, in 1980, simply a molecule that a small number of people were using very carefully, in rooms like this one, to do the most ordinary and most difficult thing that human beings attempt, to say out loud what is true. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. This story will still be here. Subscribe so the next chapter of history is waiting when you return. Sleep well. A molecule. With no category, to understand what MDMA became, you first have to understand the world it entered, and specifically, how little room that world had left for anything it could not classify. The mid-20th century was an extraordinary moment in the history of pharmacology. The decades between 1945 and 1970 had produced a cascade of psychoactive compounds. Some of them intentional, many of them discovered by accident, almost none of them fully understood before they were deployed at enormous scale. Chlorpromazine arrived in 1952 and transformed psychiatric hospitals within a year. Patients who had spent years in physical restraint were calmed, managed, made tractable by a pill. Whether they were also helped was a more complicated question, and it was asked less urgently than the simpler one of whether they were quieter. Meprobamat appeared in 1955 and was marketed to housewives under the name Milltown as a peace pill, a way of taking the sharp edges off modern life. Benzodiazepines followed in the early 1960s, Librium, Valium, a family of compounds that the pharmaceutical industry promoted with an enthusiasm calibrated precisely to the size of the American anxiety market. The message these drugs carried was consistent, and it was industrial. The modern mind produces distress. Distress has a chemical basis. Chemistry can solve it. The logic was not entirely wrong, but it was flattened in its application, applied to an enormous range of human suffering without particularly distinguishing between causes, durations, or what the person suffering might most need. By 1970, Valium was the most prescribed drug in the United States. The psychiatrist who wrote a prescription for it in under 4 minutes was practicing, within the standards of the era, perfectly acceptable medicine. Meanwhile, a different pharmacological tradition had been developing in parallel, largely outside the mainstream. LSD had been synthesized in 1938 by Albert Hofmann at Sandoz Laboratories in Basel, and its psychedelic properties had been discovered accidentally in 1943, when Hofmann absorbed a small quantity through his fingertips and cycled home through a Switzerland that appeared to have rearranged itself. Through the 1950s, LSD had been studied with genuine scientific seriousness, as a treatment for alcoholism at hospitals in Saskatchewan, as an adjunct to psychotherapy at the Los Angeles Veterans Administration, as a potential treatment for anxiety in dying patients at Spring Grove Hospital in Maryland. The research was real, the results in some trials were striking, and the scientific conversation had not yet been completely overtaken by the cultural one. The cultural one arrived in the form of the 1960s, and it was decisive. Timothy Leary, the tabloids, the hate, the Senate hearings, the Nixon administration's conviction that psychedelics were a tool of social disintegration. By 1970, the Controlled Substances Act had placed LSD in Schedule 1 alongside heroin, ending the research era with a legal mechanism that was not designed to be reversed. The scientists who had been doing the work closed their labs. The patients who had been benefiting lost access. The knowledge that had accumulated vanished into unpublished notes, and the memories of researchers who had learned not to speak about this in grant applications. This was the landscape MDMA stepped into, or rather, the landscape it sidestepped. Because MDMA was not LSD, not remotely. It did not produce visual distortions, ego dissolution, the overwhelming sensory reorganization that made LSD simultaneously fascinating and terrifying to the nervous system of mid-century psychiatry. MDMA sat in a pharmacological category that no one had quite invented yet. Some researchers would eventually reach for the term entactogen, derived from the Greek for touching within, to describe its effects. Others used empathogen. Neither term was in the psychiatric vocabulary of 1977, because the psychiatric vocabulary of 1977 had no reason to have developed it. The compound had never been formally studied. Its effects on the human mind had never been written up in a peer-reviewed journal. It was, in every institutional sense, new. It was new because it had been ignored. Its molecular structure had been in the chemical literature since 1912, filed in a Merck patent that was neither celebrated nor suppressed, simply recorded and forgotten. The pharmacological space it occupied, not a hallucinogen, not a stimulant, not a sedative, not a simple mood elevator, meant that it didn't fit the classification systems that existed when it finally attracted serious attention. The DEA's scheduling framework asked, is this a hallucinogen, a depressant, a stimulant? MDMA answered, it is something else. The answer was not well received. The chemist who would eventually bring MDMA to the attention of the therapeutic community had a sophisticated understanding of how molecular structure shaped experience. Alexander Shulgin had spent 2 decades developing a vocabulary for this, precise, empirical, unglamorous, in a small laboratory behind his house in the hills above Lafayette, California. He described MDMA, when he finally encountered it in the mid-1970s, as a window. Not a door, not a tunnel, not a high. A window that allowed the ordinary person to look at themselves without the usual layer of distorting glass. He did not find a simple word for this, because no simple word existed for it. A small network of therapists found it for themselves instead, through clinical observation over the course of several careful years. They worked in rooms with shuttered windows and glasses of water on side tables, without publishing their methods, without speaking at conferences, without seeking institutional approval that they understood would not be given. They used it with couples with trauma survivors, with people who had been in severe anxiety for years without finding anything that helped. They called the compound Adam. The name suggested a state before armor, before the accumulated defenses that people spend decades building between themselves and what they feel. The armor was the problem, in most of the cases they were working with. Not the feeling underneath it, not the memory or the grief or the fear. Those could be survived. The armor was what made survival into something smaller than a life. What MDMA appeared to do, in clinical observation, was lower the armor without removing the person wearing it. The patient remained coherent. They remained themselves. They did not hallucinate. They did not lose their sense of where they were or who they were with. What they lost, temporarily, was the reflexive flinching, the shutting down that happened whenever the conversation approached what mattered most. And in that temporary window, the conversation could go where it needed to go. The therapy network that grew up around this discovery kept no records that could be seized, published nothing that could be cited against them, and told no one outside the network who wasn't prepared to use what they learned. They understood that the moment the compound became visible was the moment it became a target. So they worked for years in the careful quiet of rooms that history was not yet watching. The compound in those rooms was not called ecstasy. No one was photographing it. No one was dancing. The therapeutic history of MDMA is one of the least known chapters in 20th century psychiatry. If you had no idea it began in a therapy room rather than on a dance floor, leave that in the comments when you wake. The patent that nobody noticed. The year is 1912 and the pharmaceutical chemists at the Merck company in Darmstadt, Germany, are not thinking about consciousness. They are thinking about a business problem, which is a considerably more tractable subject. The problem belongs to a class that pharmaceutical laboratories of the era knew well. A rival firm, in this case Bayer, had recently patented a blood-clotting agent called hydrastinine, derived from a plant alkaloid, and promoted for use in controlling excessive bleeding in surgery and gynecological practice. Hydrastinine had commercial potential. The patent meant that Merck could not manufacture or sell it. The standard solution was a synthesis search. Find a compound that achieved a similar clinical effect through a different chemical route, file your own patent, and compete on the market without infringing on Bayer's intellectual property. This was normal work. It was the bread and butter activity of industrial pharmaceutical chemistry in an era before the regulatory framework that would later govern drug development had been constructed. A Merck chemist, his name does not appear prominently in the company's records of this period, began working through a series of methylated phenethylamine compounds in the search for viable hydrastinine alternatives. The phenethylamine family was already well known to organic chemists by 1912. It was the structural backbone from which a wide range of biologically active compounds could be derived, including adrenaline, which had been isolated and characterized only a decade earlier. The synthesis work was methodical, documented, unremarkable, in the sense that all such work was unremarkable until something interesting emerged from it. In the course of this exploration, the chemist synthesized a compound designated internally as methylsofrilamine. Its full systematic name, which would not be formalized in its current form until much later, was 3,4-methylenedioxymethamphetamine. The compound was produced as an intermediate, a step in the synthesis pathway towards something else, not the intended destination. Standard documentation was completed. Molecular weight, synthesis route, basic physical properties. No pharmacological testing was conducted. There was no reason to conduct any. The compound was not the target. It was a waypoint. The patent application was filed in Berlin in December of 1912, listing the compound among a series of related structures whose synthesis routes Merck wished to protect. The German Imperial Patent Office granted the patent in May of 1914, just months before the continent plunged into the war. That would end the era in which Darmstadt pharmaceutical laboratories were among the most important in the world. Merck filed the patent not because the compound had demonstrated any useful effect, but because patent law rewarded the breadth of claims, and claiming the synthesis routes of as many structurally related compounds as possible was standard protective practice. The compound that would eventually be called MDMA was thus locked into the historical record before anyone had ever put it inside a living creature, before anyone had any idea whether it crossed the blood-brain barrier, before anyone had thought to ask what it might do to the mind. It existed as a patent claim, a structural formula, a set of reaction conditions. It existed in the way that thousands of other patented compounds existed, as a mark on paper, a legal instrument, a piece of intellectual property attached to a molecule that had not yet been asked to do anything. And so it remained without revision, without update, for more than 6 decades. The chemist moved on to other work. Merck moved on to other discoveries. The First World War disrupted the European pharmaceutical industry profoundly, rerouting supply chains, consuming labor, destroying infrastructure. The Weimar Republic came and produced its own upheavals. The second, catastrophically worse war arrived and went. The post-war boom in pharmaceutical development produced antibiotics, antihistamines, cortisone, antipsychotics, tranquilizers, a cascade of genuinely novel compounds that rearranged the possibilities of medicine. None of it touched the Darmstadt patent. MDMA sat in the chemical literature the way that certain books sit on the back shelves of a library, present, catalogued, accessible to anyone who thought to look, visited by no one. The silence was broken, briefly and inconclusively, in 1953. In the years following the Second World War, the United States military and intelligence communities developed an interest in psychoactive compounds that went well beyond therapeutic application. The CIA's MKUltra program, which would become one of the most documented scandals in American intelligence history, was in full operation by the early 1950s, exploring whether LSD, mescaline, and a range of other compounds could be used for interrogation, or to produce psychological disorientation in adversaries. The Army's Chemical Corps maintained a parallel research program at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, with a specific focus on incapacitating or behavior-modifying agents. In 1953, as part of this classified research effort, a team at the Edgewood Arsenal evaluated a series of phenethylamine compounds for potential behavioral effects. The declassified records, which became publicly available decades later, show that MDMA, listed under a numerical code designation, EA.175, was included in the evaluation. The results were classified. The Army's primary interest lay with other compounds, particularly mescaline and a substance called BZ, a powerful anticholinergic that produced severe disorientation and was ultimately rejected for military use because its effects were considered too unpredictable. MDMA attracted no particular note. The evaluation recorded that it had been studied and passed over. The research remained classified for decades. When it was finally declassified and reviewed by journalists and historians in the 1980s, the records provided evidence that the Army had examined MDMA before any civilian researcher had formally studied it, which meant, among other things, that the US government had known the compound existed in a pharmacologically interesting form, well before the DEA decided it had never had accepted medical use. The legal implications of this were noted by attorneys working on the scheduling challenge. The practical effect on policy was negligible. In the decades between the Army's classified assessment and Alexander Shulgin's laboratory work in the mid-1970s, MDMA appears in the scientific literature only in scattered references. A structural note here, a synthesis variant there. Two researchers at the University of Michigan produced a paper in the early 1960s that mentioned the compound in passing. A small number of European chemists documented related synthesis routes. None of these references were the work of researchers who had administered MDMA to a living organism and observed the result. They were the notes of people who had encountered a molecule in a library of molecules and catalogued what they found. What this 60-year silence meant, practically, was that when the compound finally reached people who were curious about what it did, they were starting from almost nothing. There was no established safety profile. There was no history of clinical use. There was no animal study literature of any depth. There were the synthesis routes in the patent and the classified army records that most researchers had no access to. And beyond those, there was the willingness to proceed empirically, which is to say, the willingness to ingest the compound in a careful setting and observe what followed. This willingness was not recklessness. It was, in the tradition of chemical research, stretching back through Albert Hofmann and before him, to a long line of pharmacologists who had used themselves as first-line subjects, the method available to people working outside the institutional structures that provided animal research facilities and clinical trial infrastructure. Shulgin used himself. Zeff's network used themselves. The early therapeutic work was built on self-experimentation by researchers who understood what they were doing and accepted the risks it entailed. The alternative was not to know. The Darmstadt chemist who synthesized MDMA in 1912 probably never thought about it again after filing the patent. He had other things to do, other compounds to synthesize, other routes to explore, the whole machinery of industrial pharmaceutical chemistry moving around him without pause. He had created something whose importance he could not have imagined, and whose eventual history he would not live to see. The molecule sat in its patent, patient and unremarked, waiting for someone to notice what it was. The notice, when it finally came, arrived from an unexpected direction. Not from a pharmaceutical corporation, not from a government laboratory. From a man in a garden shed in the California hills, working alone, in the summer heat, with notebooks full of careful observations and no particular interest in what the world thought of what he was finding. It is worth pausing, before moving to what came next, on the strangeness of this origin. The history of important pharmacological discoveries is full of accidents. Albert Hofmann cycling home through Basel on a spring afternoon in 1943 after accidentally absorbing a small quantity of LSD through his fingertips, William Perkin producing a useless purple sludge while attempting to synthesize quinine and noticing it made a beautiful dye. MDMA's origin is of a different kind. It was not discovered accidentally in the sense that its psychoactive properties were stumbled upon. It was synthesized deliberately, and its psychoactive properties went entirely unnoticed for 60 years. The accident was the forgetting. The discovery was the remembering. The Merck company's subsequent relationship to its own patent became a minor footnote in the legal history of MDMA's scheduling. When the DEA moved to place MDMA in Schedule Schutterodium in 1984, Merck was contacted in the course of the regulatory process. The company confirmed the patent, confirmed that no commercial development of the compound had ever been pursued, and confirmed that no pharmacological testing had been conducted by the company at any point in the 7 decades since the patent was filed. Merck had no stake in the compound. The patent had long since expired. They were simply the organization that had, by accident, been first. The broader context of German industrial pharmaceutical chemistry in 1912 helps explain why the compound went unnoticed. The Darmstadt laboratory was operating at a scale and pace of synthesis that made individual compounds disposable. The era before systematic pharmacological screening meant that compounds were typically evaluated only if they were the intended result of a synthesis, the target, not the byproduct. An intermediate compound that didn't become the intended product would not have been extracted purified, and dosed into laboratory animals as a matter of routine. The resources and the conceptual framework for systematic screening of pharmacological byproducts did not yet exist. MDMA fell through a gap that was structural, not careless. What the gap preserved, inadvertently, was the compound's availability, because MDMA had never been developed by Merck and had never been brought to market. It had never been subjected to the kind of commercial analysis that might have led a pharmaceutical company to potent related compounds more aggressively, or to discourage independent research, or to regard any future researcher's interest in the molecule as a business threat. When Shulgin resynthesized it in 1976, there was no corporate claim on what he had made. When the therapy network used it in the late 1970s and early 1980s, no pharmaceutical company had a financial interest in how it was used or regulated. The 6 decades of silence had kept the compound's future open in ways that commercial development would have foreclosed. The Darmstadt laboratory no longer exists in the form it did in 1912. The Merck company went through the upheavals of 2 wars and a century of consolidation, and eventually separated into 2 independent companies. The notebooks from that era of research, to whatever extent they survived, sit in an archive that no MDMA researcher has had reason to examine in detail. The chemist who synthesized methylsophylamine in the course of a hydrastin search is unknown to history. He made something significant without knowing it, and the record of his making does not include his name. If the hidden archive of pharmaceutical history interests you, the compounds discovered by accident and forgotten for decades, the story of laudanum, the Victorian cure-all built on pure opium, is already waiting on this channel. The man in the garden, Alexander Shulgin, was born in Berkeley, California, in 1925. He enlisted in the Navy at 17, was sent to study at Harvard, and by the end of the war had accumulated enough academic credit to transfer to UC Berkeley on his return. He completed a doctorate in biochemistry there in 1954, in the years before the program existed in quite that form, working in the intersection of organic chemistry and biology that would define his professional life. He was not, by training or temperament, a clinician. He was a chemist. He was interested in what molecules were, how they were built, and increasingly, as his career developed, what they did when they crossed into living tissue. His first encounter with a psychedelic compound came not from a laboratory, but from a prescription. In 1960, Shulgin was given mescaline sulfate by a colleague who was studying it, took it in a careful setting, and reported an experience that he described in characteristically unpretentious terms. The world had not changed. His relationship to the world had changed. He could see the structure of his own perception, as if from a slight remove, and what he saw was interesting. He was not frightened. He was curious. Curiosity, in Shulgin's case, had institutional consequences. He had joined Dow Chemical in the late 1950s, and in 1963 he synthesized for Dow a pesticide called Zectrin, which became commercially successful enough that the company offered him a rare arrangement: use of the company's analytical equipment for personal research projects, funded on Dow's time. Shulgin used this access to begin studying psychoactive phenethylamines in a structured way. He also began using them himself. The 2 activities were, in his mind, inseparable. He left Dow in 1966, having concluded that a corporate environment would not accommodate the work he intended to do, and established the laboratory that would occupy him for the rest of his career. The laboratory was a wooden outbuilding behind the house he shared with his first wife in the hills above Lafayette, California, a small community in Contra Costa County, 20 miles east of San Francisco, where the air in summer carried the dry scent of the surrounding hills, and the evenings came in slowly. The lab itself was roughly the size of a large garden shed. It had no climate control. In summer, the temperature inside could exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the smell of solvents and reagents hung in the still air with particular intensity. Shulgin worked in it through the heat without complaint. It was, he said on more than one occasion, exactly as he liked it. His methodology was unusual by the standards of pharmacological research, though consistent with a tradition that ran from Hoffman backward through the history of chemistry. He synthesized compounds from scratch using equipment that, for the era, was comprehensive for a private facility: a rotary evaporator, a vacuum pump, a gas chromatograph, extensive reference glassware. He characterized each compound chemically, and then he consumed it himself in a process that was incremental, documented, and guided by a rating scale he developed and published in his notebooks. The scale ran from a +1, a threshold effect barely perceptible, to a +4, which he reserved for experiences of the most profound kind and experienced, he noted, very rarely. He first encountered MDMA in the mid-1970s through a graduate student at San Francisco State University named Mary Kleinman, who had been doing preliminary work on the compound and brought it to his attention. Shulgin was not the first person in the post-war period to have noted the compound in the chemical literature. There had been a small body of parallel work in Europe and the United States, and at least one published reference in the academic literature from the early 1960s. But he was the first person to understand what it was in terms of its experiential profile, to administer it to himself in graduated doses, and document what he found with the precision that characterized all of his work. He resynthesized MDMA in his Lafayette laboratory in 1976. The first trial was at a sub-threshold dose, which revealed nothing in particular. He increased the dose incrementally over subsequent trials, each time waiting a sufficient interval between trials to allow for tolerance to diminish. His documentation of the experience that emerged at what he later described as the active dose fills several notebook pages in a style that was his own: empirical, unhurried, free of the grandiosity that characterized much psychedelic writing of the era. He did not describe a high in any conventional sense. He described a state in which the ordinary cognitive machinery continued to function. Thinking was clear, speech was unimpaired, time moved at its normal pace, but in which the underlying emotional weather had changed. The friction of self-examination, the defensive flinching that most people experience when they attempt introspection on difficult topics, was not present. He could look at things about himself that he would ordinarily have looked away from, and he could look at them without distress. This was not the same as not having the feelings. The feelings were present. The relationship to them was different. He wrote, it was as though something had opened temporarily that normally stays closed. He called it a window, not a door, which implies you can walk through it and arrive somewhere else. A window. You see more clearly. You see things you did not know were visible, and when it closes, you are still where you were. But you have seen. He gave it a +3 on his scale, meaning a meaningful and controllable experience, below the most intense compounds in his library, but above anything that could be described as simply pleasant. He understood almost immediately that the compound's value was not recreational, or rather, that if it were used recreationally, something essential would be lost in the translation. What he had experienced was not entertainment. It was something closer to a clinical tool of unusual specificity. The kind of tool that a therapist might find, in the right circumstances, to be transformative. The decision he made next was the most consequential of his professional career, though he could not have known it at the time. He introduced MDMA to Leah Zeff, a Jungian psychotherapist in Oakland whom he had known for several years, and trusted as a person of both clinical competence and ethical seriousness. He provided a small quantity, described his own experience as clearly as his notes allowed, and explained his sense that this compound sat in a therapeutic space that nothing else quite occupied. Zeff called him some weeks later. The call was brief. Zeff said that he agreed, that what Shulgin had given him was unlike anything he had encountered in his clinical work with psychedelics, and that he intended to use it. Shulgin noted the call in his diary. He returned to his laboratory and to the 100 other compounds on his synthesis list. The Lafayette Hills were dry and warm outside the shed's uninsulated walls, and the notebooks accumulated on their shelves, and the work went on. Shulgin's own relationship with MDMA was characteristic of his approach to every compound he discovered. He considered it valuable, returned to it occasionally, and did not regard it as special beyond what its specific properties merited. He had other compounds he preferred for different purposes in different moods. MDMA was the one that had the clearest therapeutic application. That was its characteristic. He was not its prophet. He was its chemist. The distinction mattered to him. His DEA relationship was, for much of this period, unusual rather than adversarial. He had obtained a Schedule I research license in the early 1970s, which gave him legal access to controlled substances for research purposes, and the DEA found him occasionally useful as a forensic consultant on drug identification cases. He was, by their own account, cooperative. The license represented an odd situation. A private researcher in a garden shed, working on compounds of increasing potency, formally credentialed by the same agency that would later move to end his work. The contradiction did not resolve itself so much as it slowly accumulated over the following decade, until the weight of it finally arrived. In the lab behind the house, among the solvents and the notebooks and the heat, Shulgin kept working. He would ultimately synthesize and document more than 200 novel phenethylamine compounds, each one tested first on himself, each one assigned a rating and a description and a set of synthesis notes that would eventually fill 2 large books. MDMA was entry number 109 in the first of those books. By the time the book was written, it had already changed more lives than any compound he ever made. He did not, in the Lafayette lab, know this yet. What he knew was the formula, the yield, the melting point, the experiential character at the +3 threshold. He knew that he had given it to a therapist in Oakland, and that the therapist had called to say it worked. For the moment, in the dry California heat, that was enough. The DEA's relationship with Shulgin became more complicated as the 1980s progressed, and the compounds in his notebooks grew in number and public visibility. His schedule. I research license had been granted at a time when the DEA had few private researchers of his caliber to consult on forensic questions, and the agency had used him regularly for drug identification work on compounds seized in enforcement operations. This gave him a peculiar position in the regulatory landscape. Simultaneously, a licensed Schedule I researcher and the synthesizer of a growing catalogue of novel psychoactive compounds that the DEA would eventually regard as a reference manual for illicit chemists. The DEA conducted an inspection of his Lafayette laboratory in 1994, resulting in the revocation of his Schedule I license. He continued his work under state licenses where he could. The notebooks kept filling. Shulgin's 1991 book Pickle, Phenethylamines I Have Known and Loved, co-written with his wife Anne. Included in its second half, the synthesis routes and experiential descriptions of 179 phenethylamine compounds, including MDMA. Its publication was an act of unusual transparency in a field that the DEA was actively trying to restrict. A complete reference for the synthesis of compounds that were either already scheduled or that bore structural relationships to scheduled compounds. Shulgin defended the publication as a scientific document, which it was. His position was that the information belonged in the scientific literature, rather than in private notebooks that would die with him. The DEA regarded it as something closer to a cookbook. The tension between these positions was never resolved, only managed, and it followed Shulgin until his death in 2014. If the story is slowing you towards sleep, let it. Subscribe before you rest. The next episode will be here when you return. Adam in the room. Leo Zeff was 67 years old when Alexander Shulgin introduced him to MDMA. He had practiced Jungian psychotherapy in Oakland for more than 2 decades, working in a style that drew from the tradition of depth psychology, the idea that the most important clinical work happened not at the surface of consciousness, where patients presented their symptoms and their histories, but in the layers underneath, where the material that shaped behavior, without being visible to the person who was shaped by it, waited to be examined. He had a reputation among his peers as a gifted clinician, with an unusual tolerance for sitting with people in difficult places. He did not hurry toward resolution. He understood that some things took time, and he was willing to give them that. He had worked with psychedelics before. Through the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, Zeph had used LSD and then MDA, an MDMA relative sometimes called the love drug, in clinical sessions with carefully selected patients in carefully controlled settings. He believed, on the basis of clinical observation, that certain patients whose psychological defenses were so deeply entrenched that conventional talk therapy could not reach the material underneath them could benefit from a pharmacological reduction of those defenses, a temporary lowering that allowed the therapeutic conversation to go where it needed to go. When the Controlled Substances Act placed both compounds in Schedule Bashar-1 in 1970, the legal ground beneath this work disappeared. Zeph wound down his psychedelic practice and, by the mid-1970s, had largely retired. He came out of retirement for MDMA. The decision was not impulsive. Zeph was not an impulsive man. It was the conclusion of an experienced clinician who had spent 2 decades studying what happened when people were and were not able to access the material their symptoms were generated by, and who recognized, in MDMA, a tool he had never had before. He said to colleagues who knew him in this period that he had not expected, at his age, to encounter something this significant. What MDMA did in his clinical experience was not what LSD had done. LSD could open doors, but the doors often led into rooms that were too large, too overwhelming, too unstructured to navigate therapeutically. MDMA opened a window. The patient remained in the room they knew, with the therapist they trusted, coherent and present. What changed was the relationship to the material, not the person doing the relating. He named the compound Adam. Not because of any explicit religious reference, though the resonance was noted, a primordial state, before the fall, before the armor. He chose the name because it suggested a return to something original. The self before the defenses accumulated. The place you were before you learned that certain things were not safe to say, not safe to feel, not safe to know about yourself. Most of the patients who came to him had arrived at their conditions through precisely this process. Something had happened that required defense, and the defense had grown until it was structural, load-bearing, impossible to remove without collapse. Adam sessions, in Zeph's clinical vocabulary, offered a way to approach that structure without triggering the collapse it was designed to prevent. The sessions had a format. Patients came to the office in the morning on an empty stomach and sat in a comfortable chair or lay on a couch. The dose, typically between 75 and 125 milligrams, adjusted to the individual, was administered in a capsule with water. The therapist sat nearby, said very little, and waited. The onset of the main effects typically took between 30 and 60 minutes. There was often a period of mild anxiety in the approach. The norepinephrine component of MDMA's pharmacology produced a brief clear activation of the body's alerting system, a flush of warmth, an elevated heartbeat. This was explained to patients beforehand. It passed. What followed the come-up period was what therapists in the network described, with some consistency, as an opening. The usual cognitive friction, the subtle internal censorship that edited what one could say in therapy, the reflexive minimizing or deflecting that patients often barely noticed in themselves, became temporarily unavailable. Patients who had spent years in conventional therapy without being able to approach certain subjects found themselves able to approach them directly, not because the subjects were no longer painful. Because the pain no longer triggered the shutdown, the memory could be present without the person being overwhelmed by it. The range of applications that Zeph and the network he built explored was broad. Couples therapy was one of the earliest and most consistently successful applications. The compound's apparent capacity to reduce defensive reactivity and increase feelings of warmth and openness made it, in clinical sessions, a tool for couples who had become so entrenched in their patterns of conflict that ordinary therapy had become a replication of the argument rather than a step toward resolution. Therapists described sessions in which couples who had been unable to speak honestly to each other for years found, within the framework of an Adam session, that they were able to. The effects of these conversations, they reported, persisted well beyond the duration of the compound's pharmacological action. The conversation that had been made possible in the session remained possible afterward, not always, not without effort, but with a frequency that conventional couples therapy had not been producing. Post-traumatic presentations were another territory. The formal diagnostic category of PTSD had been added to the DSM-3 in 1980, partly in response to the documented experiences of Vietnam veterans, and the clinical literature was still developing its understanding of what the diagnosis meant and how it could be treated. What Zeff's network found, in session after session, was that patients with histories of severe trauma, combat veterans, survivors of sexual violence, people who had experienced childhood abuse, could approach their traumatic material in Adam sessions in ways that conventional therapy had failed to make possible. The material was present but not overwhelming. The person could hold it, examine it, begin to integrate it. This was not the same as resolving the trauma. It was the beginning of the process. And for many patients, it was the first time the beginning had been accessible. A smaller number of therapists in the network worked with survivors of sexual abuse who had been through years of conventional therapy without being able to speak about what had happened to them. The presentation was typically the same. The conversation would approach the subject, and something would shut down. Not a dramatic breakdown, but a quiet withdrawal. The patient becoming suddenly polite and slightly absent, the session continuing around the center of the thing, without quite touching it. Adam sessions, in several clinical reports that were later shared within the network, though never published, produced the opposite effect. Patients spoke. Not always easily, not always without tears. But they spoke, and what they said opened the conversation that the years of conventional therapy had been circling. A smaller application drew particular attention within the network, working with patients who were dying. Several therapists in California began offering Adam sessions to terminally ill people, primarily cancer patients in the final phase of their illness, not as a treatment for the disease, and not as a form of denial, but as a way of approaching the fear of death, with the fear temporarily reduced. What patients described after these sessions was varied, but often followed a recognizable pattern. A reduced sense of the self as something that must at all costs survive. Not resignation, something closer to permission. A shift in the relationship to the ending that allowed the remaining time to be lived with less of the terror that had been consuming it. Clinicians described patients who, after Adam sessions, were able to speak to their families about dying in ways they had been unable to before, and who reported reduced anxiety in the weeks following the session. Zeff began training other therapists to use MDMA in the late 1970s, conducting small workshops and informal seminars with colleagues he trusted. He was extremely selective about whom he approached. He chose people with long clinical experience, people he had known for years, people who understood that what they were doing existed entirely outside the institutional structures that would normally sanction such work. The training was not formal. It was transmitted through direct experience, through conversation, through supervised practice. The therapists who went through it came away with both the method and the implicit obligation of the method, care, discretion, and silence. Estimates of how many therapists Zeff trained before his death in 1988 vary widely, but the figure most consistently cited by people who knew him is in the range of 4,000. Not all of them used MDMA with patients. Many incorporated it selectively with specific patients for specific purposes. The network was loose, geographically dispersed, and deliberately non-hierarchical. There was no organization, no membership, no directory. Therapists knew other therapists. Information traveled through personal connection, which was the only way to ensure it traveled only to people who would use it well. The financial arrangements were, by the standards of underground pharmaceutical therapy, unusually ethical. Most therapists in the network did not charge additional fees for Adam sessions. They were not profiting from the compound. Some sourced it through Shulgin's laboratory connections. Some obtained it through the supply chains that had not yet attracted regulatory attention. None of them were wealthy from it. Several of them spent money out of their own accounts to obtain material for patients who could not afford to pay extra. Through the early 1980s, the network grew. New therapists were trained. New clinical applications were explored. The geography of the network expanded beyond California to the Pacific Northwest, to Texas, to the East Coast. And the silence, for a while, held. The world outside these offices knew nothing about Adam. The world outside was not looking in these particular rooms. The compounds being studied by researchers with DEA licenses and federal funding were different compounds. The compound being used by unlicensed therapists in private offices was not on anyone's list. Then the name changed, and the list grew longer. The underground therapy network of the late 1970s and early 1980s worked in complete silence for years. If you had been a patient who had run out of options, and this existed, leave that thought in the comments below whenever you wake. The name that sold it. What the therapists in California and the Pacific Northwest were doing in private offices, a different group of people was doing in public, with a very different set of intentions. The city was Dallas. The year was somewhere between 1980 and 1982, and the people involved were not therapists. They were entrepreneurs, music industry figures, and a collection of individuals whose connections to the counterculture were genuine, but whose primary interest in MDMA was commercial rather than therapeutic. They had encountered the compound through the informal networks that carried knowledge of unusual substances across the American landscape of the era. The overlapping social worlds of musicians, researchers, and curious people that had been distributing such knowledge at varying levels of legal risk since the early 1970s. The crucial fact that shaped what followed was straightforward. In 1981, MDMA was not illegal. There had been no federal scheduling decision. No state law had specifically targeted it. The compound existed in a legal grey zone, clearly psychoactive, clearly of interest to people who used recreational substances, but not named in any existing controlled substances legislation at the state or federal level. This was not a loophole engineered by clever lawyers. The compound had simply never attracted enough mainstream attention to be scheduled. The DEA's attention in 1981 was on cocaine, on heroin, on the amphetamine supply chain. A phenethylamine sitting in a 60-year-old German patent was not on the priority list. The Texas Group, the name by which they would later be collectively known in court documents and journalistic accounts, recognized this legal opening and moved through it with considerable organizational sophistication. They established distribution networks in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, connected to clubs and bars and the social circuits of the city's young professional class. They were not operating in shadow. They were, as far as they understood it, running a legal business. They kept records. Several of them paid taxes on the income. They had a telephone order line, one of the first documented instances in American history of a psychoactive substance being sold openly by phone and delivered by mail, at a time when doing so was entirely legal. The question of what to call the compound was not a trivial one. In the therapeutic network in California, the compound was called Adam. This name had a meaning. It carried the implication of an original, pre-armored state, an identity that preceded the defenses that trauma and life accumulated. The name was appropriate for a therapy room and entirely inappropriate for a bar. It suggested earnestness, which was not what the Texas Group was selling. The naming deliberations within the group were later described by several participants in interviews and court proceedings. Multiple names were considered. The most prominent alternative was empathy, a description of what the compound seemed most specifically to produce, and an accurate one. Several members of the group advocated for it. The argument against it was market-based and unambiguous. Empathy was not a selling point in a nightlife context. It sounded clinical. It sounded like something a therapist would offer. It was the kind of word that sent young professionals in Dallas bars back to their vodka sodas. The name they chose was Ecstasy. The selection has been attributed to various members of the group in various accounts, and the precise moment of the decision has been lost in the inconsistencies of recollection. What is clear is that it was a deliberate commercial choice. Ecstasy promised not a therapeutic window, but a transcendence. Not revelation, but elevation. Not access to what was true about you, but access to something beyond what you normally were. It was aspirational in the way that luxury brands were aspirational. It was the right name for a product being sold at a bar. It was also, from the perspective of the therapeutic network in California, a catastrophe. The name Adam had carried a kind of protection. It was obscure, specific, meaningful only to those already in the know. Ecstasy was a public invitation. It was a word that could be written on a flyer, spoken in a crowd, reported in a newspaper. The California therapists understood, when ecstasy began to spread beyond Texas, that the clock they had always known was running had just accelerated. The commercial operation grew quickly. Within 2 years of its establishment, the Texas group was distributing MDMA across the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area through a network that included bars, private clubs, and social events. The pricing structure was calibrated to the market. Wholesale prices for larger quantities, retail pricing, approximately $20 to $25 per dose, for individual sales. The customer base in the early years was notable for its demographics. The compound attracted, in Dallas in the early 1980s, not the students and counterculture figures who had been the primary market for most recreational psychedelics of the previous decade, but young professionals, lawyers, architects, people in the financial sector, people who went home and went to work the next morning and had no particular identity as drug users. This demographic was partly a function of price and partly a function of the compound's character. MDMA did not produce the disorientation or the visual complexity that made LSD unsuitable for people who wanted to remain functional. It produced warmth, openness, and a quality of social ease that fit without great difficulty into the professional social world. People took it at dinner parties. They took it at private gatherings. The bar scene in Dallas in the early 1980s was, in certain circles, operating with a background MDMA use that was neither hidden nor particularly discussed, simply present the way alcohol was present. By 1983 and 1984, estimates from DEA records and court proceedings suggest that the Texas group was moving somewhere between 20 and 30,000 doses of MDMA per month in the Dallas-Fort Worth area alone. The compound had spread beyond Texas to Atlanta, to New Orleans, to college towns throughout the South, carried by travelers and social networks in the way that musical trends spread. The telephone order line was handling calls from across the country. The operation had acquired, in business terms, genuine scale. The distribution network had also attracted satellite operations, smaller groups in other cities who obtained MDMA through the Texas supply chain and distributed it in their own markets. Some of these operations were careful and low profile, others were not. The cumulative visibility of all of them was moving MDMA from an obscure compound known to therapists and chemists into something that DEA field agents in multiple cities were beginning to hear about from informants. The therapeutic network in California was aware of this. Several therapists had, through the overlapping social networks that connected the therapy community and the counterculture, encountered people who had used ecstasy recreationally and compared notes. The clinical picture was reassuring and disturbing simultaneously. Reassuring because casual users were not, generally speaking, being harmed. Disturbing because the visibility that commercial distribution was creating was exactly the kind of visibility that triggered scheduling. There was also a subtler concern, one that was discussed in the therapy network with a kind of sorrow that the commercial operators did not share. The compound in a bar was not the compound in a therapy room. Not because the chemistry was different, because the context was everything. MDMA's therapeutic value was inseparable from the setting in which it was used, the preparation of the person using it, the presence of a trained person to guide the experience. Strip away the setting, the preparation, the guidance, put the compound in a glass and hand it to someone at a bar. And what you had was a pleasant drug. Not a dangerous one, in most cases, but not the thing the therapy network had been carefully protecting for the previous 5 years. The protection ended when the DEA noticed. The notice, when it came, was swift and decided, and it changed everything that followed. The specific geography of the Texas operation has become more, rather than less, documented over time, as court proceedings and investigative journalism have produced accounts from participants who were, by the time they spoke, no longer at legal risk from speaking. The distribution network was centered in Dallas, but extended into Houston, Austin, and San Antonio through a series of informal arrangements with nightclub owners, bar managers, and social figures in each city's professional social world. The compound moved through what could be reasonably described as a sales force, individuals who maintained customer relationships, who could be reached by phone to arrange delivery, who operated within the social circles of people likely to be interested. The pricing structure created its own economics. At $20 to $25 per dose retail, and at an estimated 30,000 doses per month, moving through the Texas Group's primary market by 1983 and 1984, the operation was generating revenues in the range of $600,000 to $750,000 per month. This was not organized crime in the traditional sense. There was no violence, no territorial enforcement, no connection to the heroin or cocaine supply chains that the DEA's primary enforcement attention was focused on. It was, structurally, a specialty consumer goods business that happened to be selling a psychoactive compound. The participants understood this. Some of them described it in exactly these terms. The legality that the Texas Group relied on was genuine, but fragile in a way they may not have fully appreciated. The DEA had the authority, under the 1984 Comprehensive Crime Control Act, to emergency schedule a substance if it determined that emergency action was required to avoid imminent hazard to public safety. This authority could be invoked quickly, within weeks of a decision being made internally. The Texas Group's telephone order line, the advertising in music publications, the availability in bars and clubs, constituted precisely the kind of public visibility that made the emergency authority available, and, more importantly, made its invocation politically comfortable. A substance being sold in bars with a branded name, at high volume, to middle-class professionals. This was not a situation that any DEA administrator was going to decline to address. The therapy community's dismay at the commercialization was not merely territorial. It was practical and empirical. The therapists who had been working with MDMA since the late 1970s had accumulated clinical observations about set and setting that the commercial operation was ignoring by design. They had found that the compound's effects were profoundly context-dependent, that the emotional material it surfaced, the quality of the openness it produced, varied enormously with the expectations, the preparation, and the environment of the person using it. A carefully prepared therapy patient, in a quiet room with a trusted guide, experienced something categorically different from a stranger who had been handed a tablet in a Dallas bar without preparation, guidance, or the therapeutic framework that made what followed useful, rather than simply interesting. This was not to say that recreational ecstasy use was producing widespread harm. The testimony of the people who took it in the Texas bars in 1982 and 1983 was largely positive. Pleasant evenings, social warmth, a morning after that was distinctly more agreeable than the equivalent post-alcohol experience. But the therapists watching from California were not evaluating whether the compound was pleasant. They were evaluating whether the compound's particular properties, its specific capacity for therapeutic work that no other available substance produced, were being preserved or squandered. The answer was that they were being squandered, and that the squandering was visible enough to trigger the regulatory response that would end the therapeutic work entirely. The story of how substances cross from medicine to market runs through several episodes on this channel. The history of cocaine in early Coca-Cola, in children's toothache drops, in the drawing rooms of the Edwardian professional class, is here when you're ready. The emergency the Drug Enforcement Administration first formally noticed MDMA in 1984, and the mechanism by which it responded, tells you most of what you need to know about how the American drug scheduling system worked and did not work in that era. The notice arrived through the Texas operation, which had never been designed for invisibility. DEA field agents in Dallas, in the course of routine surveillance of club drug markets, encountered MDMA in sufficient volume and across sufficient venues to conclude that something new had entered the recreational drug landscape. Samples were obtained and submitted for analysis. The analysis confirmed that what was being sold commercially, openly, for significant sums, was pharmacologically active and psychoactive. The DEA checked its scheduling lists. The compound was not on them. In July of 1984, the DEA announced its intention to place MDMA in schedule, I of the Controlled Substances Act. The announcement invoked an emergency scheduling provision, a mechanism created by the 1984 Comprehensive Crime Control Act that allowed the DEA to temporarily schedule a substance for up to a year without the normal notice and comment procedures, if the agency determined that emergency action was necessary to avoid imminent hazard to public safety. The emergency provision was designed for exactly this situation. A compound moving rapidly through commercial distribution, no legal restriction in place, the agency needing to act faster than the normal regulatory timeline allowed. What the DEA had not fully anticipated was the response from the therapeutic community. The person who organized that response was a young man named Rick Doblin, who was, at the time of the DEA's announcement, a 22-year-old college student in Florida who had encountered MDMA in a therapeutic context and understood, with a clarity that his age did not obviously predict, what the scheduling process would mean for the work that was being done with it. Doblin contacted James Bachelor and Lester Grinspoon at Harvard Medical School, researchers who had been documenting the therapeutic use of MDMA and who had the institutional credibility to participate in a legal challenge. He contacted several therapists in Zeph's network who were willing to come out of the shadows at some personal and professional risk and provide testimony. He retained legal counsel and filed a formal objection to the scheduling that triggered, under the procedural rules of the DEA, a requirement that formal adversarial hearings be held before the scheduling became permanent. The hearings ran between 1985 and 1986, producing a record that was unusual in the history of DEA scheduling proceedings. The legal contest was not conducted in the abstract language of regulatory procedure. It was conducted through testimony, through the voices of therapists describing specific patients, specific sessions, specific outcomes. A psychiatrist who had used MDMA with Vietnam veterans testified about a man who had not slept without nightmares for 11 years, and had, after 3 MDMA sessions, slept through the night. A therapist in California testified about a woman who had been unable to speak about childhood sexual abuse in 7 years of conventional therapy, and had spoken about it, fully and without dissociation, in a single ADAM session. Another clinician described the reduction of existential terror in terminal cancer patients that he had observed across dozens of sessions. The testimony was credible, specific, and documented. It was also, in structural terms, unusual, because the people providing it were describing clinical work conducted without FDA approval, without clinical trial infrastructure, without the formal validation systems that the regulatory framework recognized. They were describing an underground medicine conducted in private offices by trained professionals with compounds sourced through informal channels. The DEA's lawyers argued that this did not constitute accepted medical use within the meaning of the scheduling statute. The therapists' lawyers argued that the work was precisely what accepted medical use looked like when the regulatory system provided no pathway for it to exist in any other form. The case was decided by Administrative Law Judge Francis Young. Young was a career civil servant who had been with the DEA for many years and had presided over previous scheduling proceedings. He was not a physician or a pharmacologist. He was a lawyer, and he approached the evidence with the methodical seriousness that legal training imposed on complex fact patterns. He spent months reviewing the full record of the hearings before producing his ruling. The ruling was delivered in May of 1986. It was 31 pages long, carefully structured, and unambiguous in its conclusion. MDMA should be placed in Schedule 3, not Schedule 1. Judge Young found that the evidence presented by the therapists constituted evidence of accepted medical use within the meaning of the statute. He found that MDMA had a currently accepted medical use in treatment with safety under medical supervision. He found that the DEA had not met its burden of demonstrating that MDMA qualified for Schedule Y, and that placing it there would be inappropriate given the existing clinical record. He also wrote, in a passage that would be cited many times in the years that followed, that it would be unreasonable, arbitrary, and capricious to place MDMA in Schedule 1 under the evidence before him. The DEA administrator read the ruling. The administrator's name was John Lawn, a former senior agent who had led the agency's enforcement operations before taking the top position. Lawn considered Judge Young's recommendation, and in December of 1987, rejected it. This was legally permissible. An administrator could decline to follow a judge's recommendation, but it was rare. In the history of DEA scheduling proceedings to that point, an administrator had overruled a judge's recommendation on only a handful of occasions. The grounds given for the rejection were legal rather than scientific. Administrator Lawn concluded that the therapeutic use of MDMA by the network of clinicians did not constitute accepted medical use within the statutory meaning because it had not been through the FDA's formal approval process. The compound had never been submitted for new drug approval. It had never been manufactured commercially and subjected to controlled clinical trials. Therefore, by the administrator's reading, the legal standard had not been met, regardless of the clinical evidence. Legal scholars who subsequently reviewed the decision noted the circularity of this reasoning. MDMA could not have accepted medical use because it had not received FDA approval. It could not receive FDA approval because the clinical trials required for approval required legal access to the compound that only Schedule I research licenses could provide, licenses that were controlled by the DEA, the same agency that had just classified it. The path to approval had been made to require a door that the classifying body held the key to. MDMA was placed in Schedule Haçienda effective July 1, 1986. The therapy network stopped. Therapists who had been using the compound with patients quietly put away their supplies. A small number continued for some time afterward, accepting the legal risk. Most did not. The compound that had been reaching patients who had not been reached by anything else was now in the same legal category as heroin, with the same research restrictions and the same criminal penalties for unauthorized use. Rick Doblin founded the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, in 1986, in the same year the scheduling took effect. The organization was established with a single long-term goal: to produce the scientific evidence that would eventually compel the regulatory system to reconsider its decision. Doblin enrolled at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, convinced that the obstacle was as much political as scientific, and that solving it required understanding how political systems were changed. MAPS was small, underfunded, and regarded by mainstream psychiatry as either misguided or naive. Doblin regarded the scheduling decision as wrong, based on evidence that was clear to anyone willing to examine it. He was prepared to spend as long as it took to prove this in terms the system would accept. The system would require more than 30 years of proof. The proof was already accumulating, quietly, in the clinical records of therapists who had seen what the compound could do, and who were now watching the scheduling announcement in offices that had, overnight, become the scene of a different kind of illegality. The international comparison is instructive. The United Kingdom had actually classified MDMA 9 years before the United States. The compound was covered by the UK's blanket scheduling of phenethylamines in 1977. The same year, Leo Zeff received his first quantity from Shulgin and began therapeutic work with it. This British scheduling was not the result of any specific concern about MDMA. It was the result of a regulatory mechanism that preemptively classified entire chemical families rather than evaluating individual compounds, and MDMA happened to fall within the family covered. The UK criminalised a compound about which no public health case had been made, before any significant number of British people had taken it, years before the British rave scene would give it a social footprint. The scheduling was a regulatory housekeeping measure that preceded the activity it was ostensibly designed to address. The United States scheduling process, by contrast, came after significant commercial activity and public visibility, but used a legal category, Schedule Y, that had been designed for compounds with no legitimate use and no safety profile for use in medical supervision. The category was defined in 1970 primarily to address heroin and LSD. and the assumption built into the definition was that a Schedule I compound was simply dangerous, period, not useful in any circumstance, not capable of having accepted medical use because no responsible medical practitioner would use it. Placing MDMA in this category alongside heroin was not merely a statement about recreational use. It was a statement that the clinical work the therapy network had been doing was, definitionally, not medicine. The procedural anomaly of the DEA overruling its own administrative law judge has been noted by legal scholars as an example of the structural limitations of the scheduling system. The Controlled Substances Act gave the DEA the authority to make scheduling decisions, and also the authority to conduct the adversarial hearings designed to evaluate those decisions and, crucially, the authority to disregard the outcome of those hearings if the administrator disagreed with the judge's conclusion. This created a system in which the appearance of due process was present without the substance of due process, because the decision-maker was also the final arbiter of challenges to its own decisions. The circularity was noted in legal commentary at the time. It did not affect the outcome. Rick Doblin's decision to go to the Kennedy School of Government, rather than to a medical school or a law school, reflected a theory of the problem that the scheduling history supported. The obstacle was not primarily scientific. The science was, by the mid-1980s, already pointing clearly toward MDMA's therapeutic utility. The obstacle was not primarily legal. The legal arguments had been made in the scheduling hearings and had prevailed before the judge. The obstacle was political. A scheduling decision made in a specific political climate by a political appointee could ultimately only be reversed in a political climate that had changed sufficiently to make reversal possible. Doblin spent 30 years working to change the climate. The legal history of MDMA is longer and stranger than almost anyone knows. Subscribe so the next chapter finds you. Sleep well. The White Isle. While the legal battle in the United States moved toward its conclusion, the scheduling finalized, the research ended, the MAPS organization founded in the same year to begin the long work of reversal. Something unrelated was developing on an island off the coast of Spain. Ibiza had been a counterculture destination since the 1960s, when its relatively cheap accommodation, tolerant social atmosphere, and long Mediterranean summers had made it attractive to artists, writers, and the various categories of person seeking distance from the cultural pressures of Northern Europe. By the late 1970s, it had become a more conventional tourist destination. Bars, discos, beaches, a nightlife economy built around the seasonal migration of British and German tourists. The older hippie Ibiza existed alongside this new tourist Ibiza in an uneasy parallel, each regarding the other with varying degrees of tolerance. What emerged from this combination in the mid-1980s was something neither the hippie culture nor the tourist culture had specifically designed. The club, called Amnesia, occupied a former farmhouse in the hills above the town of San Antonio, an open-air structure, partially roofed, with an outdoor section that caught the night air from the surrounding countryside. The trees around the building were lit in the evenings with colored lights. The stone floors absorbed the night's warmth and released it slowly after midnight. The acoustics were, as open-air acoustics usually are, imperfect in ways that became their own characteristic. Sound spreading outward, losing its sharpest edges, arriving at the listener with a softness that enclosed spaces did not produce. The DJ at Amnesia, in the summers of 1985, 1986, and 1987, was an Argentine named Alfredo Fiorito, known to his regulars simply as Alfredo. He had arrived in Ibiza in the mid-1970s as a refugee from the Pinochet military dictatorship that had taken power in Chile in 1973, and from which Argentina's own military government drew both inspiration and logistical support. He came to the island because the island felt, as he described it in subsequent interviews, like a place where the usual categories did not apply. He stayed. Alfredo's approach to DJing was, by the standards of what British and American club culture had developed through the late 1970s and early 1980s, unconventional in ways that were initially jarring and ultimately transformative. he did not observe genre. On a given night at Amnesia, he might open with a Spanish pop record, move through a sequence of American house tracks from Chicago, segue into a Talking Heads record, then into an Italian synth piece, then into early Detroit techno, then into whatever the moment required. The through line was not genre coherence. It was emotional coherence, the tracking of a mood across sounds that had no commercial category in common. The crowd that Amnesia attracted was correspondingly mixed. Spanish locals danced alongside British tourists. German hippies who had been coming to the island since the 1970s occupied corners of the outdoor space alongside young Italian professionals who arrived by ferry from the mainland. The absence of dress codes, the absence of the studied coolness posturing that characterized British and American nightlife of the era, the open-air setting that dissolved the usual architectural constraints of a nightclub, all of this created a particular social texture. People talked to each other. MDMA reached the Amnesia crowd through supply networks that were informal and not particularly well documented, sometime around 1986. The compound's availability on the island coincided with Alfredo's sets in a way that was not designed, but that proved to be the most consequential accident in the history of electronic music. 4 young men from London arrived in Ibiza in the summer of 1987. They were DJs and music promoters, Danny Rampling, Paul Oakenfold, Nicky Holloway, and Johnny Walker, in their mid-20s, operating in the middle tier of London's club scene without having found their defining project. They had come to Ibiza for the reasons young Londoners went to Ibiza in the 1980s: the sun, the relative cheapness, the looseness of the atmosphere. They found themselves at Amnesia. They encountered MDMA. They heard Alfredo. Each of them later described the experience in remarkably similar terms, across interviews and memoirs separated by years, and produced in different circumstances. The common thread was a dissolution of the usual filter. The music that Alfredo was playing, which would have seemed to them in a sober London context eclectic to the point of incoherence, became, in the Ibiza night with MDMA and the open air, something structurally comprehensible and deeply moving. They could hear the architecture of what he was doing. Not the genre divisions that normally organized the perception of music, but the emotional logic that moved beneath genre, connecting a Spanish pop record and a Detroit techno track through a thread that had nothing to do with their production contexts and everything to do with how they made a body feel. The compound also did something to the social fabric of the evening. The usual distance that characterized the relationships between strangers in British social contexts, the careful not making eye contact, the performance of self-sufficiency, the sense that genuine warmth expressed towards someone you had not been properly introduced to was a form of social trespass, was simply unavailable. People spoke to each other. They danced near each other without the competitive edge that British dance floors typically carried. They were, in the terminology that would shortly follow them back to London, loved up. The phrase entered the British vernacular directly from MDMA culture and has remained in it ever since. The 4 men came home in September of 1987 and began rebuilding what they had experienced. Danny Rampling opened a club night called Shoom in January 1988 in the basement of a fitness club on Southwark Street in London. The venue's capacity was 300. The atmosphere, smoke machines, projected smiley face imagery, music that owed everything to Alfredo's eclectic Balearic approach, was unlike anything else operating in London at the time. The British club scene of the mid-1980s had been organised around studied coolness, around tribal self-identification by taste, around the performance of being unmoved. Shoom was organised around the opposite. The people who found it felt, consistently, that they had found something they had not known was missing. Paul Oakenfold launched Spectrum at Heaven. Nicky Holloway ran the trip. Johnny Walker established his own night. Within a few months of those January 1988 openings, a circuit had developed, a loose network of London basement venues and warehouse spaces that shared the Balearic musical philosophy and the MDMA social context. The word spread through the social networks of the people who had been at Shoom in its first nights, and through those networks outward, and the circuit grew, The music that was played in these rooms was already well established in Chicago and Detroit. House music had been developing in Chicago's black gay clubs since at least 1984, associated with DJs like Larry Heard and Frankie Knuckles, drawing on the deep soul and electronic rhythms of the late 1970s and transforming them into something more repetitive, more rhythmically insistent, more structurally open. Techno had been emerging from Detroit through the work of Juan Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Saunderson, music that engaged with the industrial landscape of a city in economic freefall, and responded to it with a futurism that was partly aspirational and partly rueful. Neither genre had achieved significant penetration in the British mainstream before the Ibiza connection brought them into contact with MDMA. The contact proved in a way that no one had entirely predicted to be generative. The repetitive rhythmic structures of house and techno aligned with the perceptual effects of MDMA in ways that were not coincidental once you understood the pharmacology, but that felt, to the people experiencing them in Schum's basement, like a discovery of something that had always been true and was only now being revealed. The music amplified the drug amplified the music, the social context amplified both. The summer of 1988 was still ahead. It would have a name soon. What the four DJs brought back from Ibiza was not simply a drug preference or a musical taste. They brought back an understanding of how a specific context, the open air, the mixed crowd, the music that didn't observe genre, the compound that made the music feel structural rather than decorative, could produce a quality of social experience that the British nightlife infrastructure of 1987 was not designed to produce and had not been producing. The British club scene of the mid-1980s had been organised around difference and hierarchy. The right people in the right clothes at the right venue, with the right music for the right tribe. Ibiza had organised itself around something else, and what that something else was had only become visible to the four Londoners because they had experienced it from the inside. The music they brought back was already in Britain, in the sense that the records existed, that Chicago House was available as import vinyl, that pirate radio stations had been playing some of it. What had been missing was the social context that made the music structure legible. House music at 128 beats per minute, listened to soberly in a conventional British club by a crowd maintaining its social armour, was unfamiliar, slightly abrasive, and easy to dismiss. The same music in the right company in the right state was something different, not because the music had changed, but because the listener had. The Ibiza experience was not a tutorial in how to hear house music. It was an experience of hearing it for the first time in a condition that made what it was doing audible. Alfredo's career after the British invasion of his dance floor followed a trajectory that the people he had inspired did not entirely replicate. He continued to DJ in Ibiza through the 1990s and 2000s, his reputation growing as the origin story of the Balearic sound became better documented and more romanticized. He gave interviews in which he described the summer of 1987 with the even temperament of someone who had been doing what he had always done, and was slightly puzzled that it had become, in retrospect, a cultural origin point. He had been playing music he liked, in a club he enjoyed, for a crowd he appreciated. The four men from London had been in the crowd. He had not known they were there. The word Balearic entered the vocabulary of British club culture as a descriptor of the eclectic, genre-fluid approach that Alfredo represented, and it carried with it an implication of the Ibiza context, the warmth, the openness, the absence of the usual boundaries. It was a useful word because it named not a genre, but a philosophy. The selection of music based on how it made the body and the emotions feel, rather than which shelf it came from. In the decade that followed the summer of 1987, Balearic became a term that could be applied to sets, to individual tracks, to an attitude toward music making that the British electronic music scene would explore in ways that moved far beyond what Alfredo had originated at Amnesia. Music and MDMA developed together in a way that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who wasn't present for it. If you were part of the late 1980s club or rave scene, anywhere in the world, I'd like to know what it was like. leave it below when you wake. The second summer, the Haçienda opened in May of 1982 on Whitworth Street in Manchester, and for its first 5 years of operation, it lost money with a consistency that would have been remarkable, even in an industry known for financial precariousness. The costs were architectural. The building was large, the renovation had been expensive, the maintenance was ongoing. The programming was ambitious but not commercially calibrated. Attendance on most nights was thin enough that the staff outnumbered the paying customers. New Order's manager Rob Gretton, reviewing the financial accounts in 1985, noted that the band was funding the club at a rate that would, if continued, eventually require them to keep touring indefinitely, simply to cover the overheads. The situation was, in formal business terms, unsustainable. None of this diminished the importance that the Haçienda would eventually acquire. The club had been designed by Ben Kelly, a London-based designer who approached the brief as an architectural problem rather than a nightclub problem. Kelly retained the industrial bones of the converted yacht showroom that the building had once been, the steel girders, the exposed pipework, the structural columns, and painted them in high-visibility colours, yellow-black chevron patterns drawn from road-marking conventions. The effect was a space that looked less like a nightclub than a thoughtfully designed factory floor. And this was not an accident. Factory Records, which co-owned the venue with New Order, had a consistent aesthetic that drew on the industrial and the post-industrial as visual language. The Haçienda was its physical expression. It took a specific combination of music, substance, and social moment to transform this architectural experiment into the most important club in Britain. The music arrived first, in the form of the DJs Mike Pickering and Graham Park, who had both developed their ears in venues and on pirate radio stations that were paying attention to what was happening in Chicago and Detroit. Pickering's night, called Nude, launched in 1986, brought Chicago house to the Haçienda with sufficient seriousness and at sufficient volume that the regulars who attended it began to understand what the music was doing, its relationship to rhythm, its rejection of the verse-chorus-verse structure that organized pop music, its openness to duration in a way that rock and pop composition were not designed for. The substance arrived in 1987 and 1988, via the supply chains emanating from the London scene that had crystallized around Shoom and its sister nights. Manchester's connection to London was cultural and social. It was the second city of British pop culture in the 1980s, with its own music industry, its own journalism, its own club circuit, and the compounds moving through London's network reached Manchester quickly. The Haçienda crowd that had been attending Nude with appreciation began attending it with a different quality of presence. The change was observable, immediate, and, to the DJs behind the decks, impossible to miss. The crowd on a Friday night in 1988 was not the same crowd, emotionally, as the crowd in 1986. The people had not changed, but their relationship to being in the room had changed. The studied coolness that was the standard effective posture of the British club-goer, the performance of having seen everything, the careful maintenance of distance between body and music, the surveillance of whether one was being observed, dissolved. People danced without auditing themselves. They spoke to strangers without the usual calculus of social risk. They arrived already knowing that this was going to be good. And they were right. And the knowing and the rightness fed each other in a cycle that the venue had never experienced before. The Haçienda's income in 1988 and 1989 was, relative to its previous years, striking. The bar takings dropped, which the management noted with some puzzlement, because people were consuming less alcohol. Other revenue streams increased. The crowd was larger on Friday nights than the building was comfortable holding. The reputation spread through Manchester and then outward, to Liverpool, to Leeds, to the Midlands, carried by people who had made the trip and came back describing something that seemed excessive until you saw it yourself. Manchester in 1988 was a city that had a complex relationship to what was happening in it. The industrial base that had made it central to the economic history of the English-speaking world, the mills, the textile trades, the engineering concerns, had been declining for decades, and had accelerated in its decline through the early 1980s under economic policies that had made the city's unemployment rate among the highest in England. The urban fabric bore the marks of this. Vacant factories, underused infrastructure, a city centre that was denser with promise than with activity. There was a creative culture developing in the gaps. Factory Records itself was a product of this, as were the music journalists at the NME and Sounds who had been paying close attention to what Manchester produced. But it was developing against a background of civic austerity that gave it a particular quality of determination. MDMA entered this social landscape and did something to it that the compound did wherever the social landscape was right. It reduced the class-based tribalism that organised British leisure. The Haçienda on a Friday night in 1988 brought together people who, in the ordinary social architecture of English life, would have had very little occasion to speak to each other. People from different economic backgrounds, different subcultural affiliations, different educational histories. The compound that was moving through the building dissolved temporarily the social sorting mechanisms that normally kept these groups separate. People who would not, under ordinary circumstances, have been in the same room were in the same room and were talking to each other. The Madchester sound that developed alongside the MDMA culture of the Haçienda was not simply a musical response to the drug. It was a musical response to the social experience that the drug made possible, the warmth, the looseness, the collapsing of the usual barriers. The Stone Roses, who had been operating in Manchester's music scene for several years without finding their defining sound, arrived at it in the late 1980s with a record that combined the harmonic vocabulary of classic rock with the rhythmic openness of house music. The Happy Mondays, fronted by Shaun Ryder, operated in a more explicitly chemical register. Their music was slower, heavier, built for a body that was specifically in the state that MDMA produced. The crossover between the indie guitar scene and the electronic dance scene that Madchester represented was not accidental. It was a mapping of the social crossover that the compound had enabled. The rave scene that grew alongside the club scene in 1988 and 1989 was related but distinct. The outdoor events, held in fields and warehouses outside city limits, drawing thousands of people through network-circulated flyers, and later, pirate radio announcements, developed in response to the constraint that licensed venues imposed. A licensed club could be closed. A field could not be closed easily. The audiences for these outdoor events were drawn from the same social world as the Haçienda's crowd, but were demographically broader, younger in some parts and older in others, and operating entirely outside the regulatory framework of the nighttime economy. The motorway raves of 1988 and 1989, the events organized through CB radio contact and early mobile phone networks, with hundreds of cars converging on locations revealed only hours before the event, produced some of the largest unregulated gatherings in recent British history. An event organised in an unpublicised field in the home counties in the summer of 1989 drew an estimated 25,000 people. The police were present, but in the early period, uncertain about their authority and capacity to respond. The legal framework did not quite cover what was happening. The coverage in the British press moved through phases. The initial reporting in 1988 was a mixture of bafflement and moral concern, characteristic of the way British newspapers approached new youth cultures. By 1989, the tone had hardened. The Sun and the Daily Mirror ran cover stories linking the rave scene to drug use, accurate in the sense that drug use was certainly happening, and to the danger of outdoor gatherings. The tabloid characterization of the scene as a criminal conspiracy, rather than a social movement, was influential in shaping the political response. The Haçienda itself began to experience the darker consequences of the culture it had helped create. Manchester's organised criminal networks, which had been expanding through the late 1980s in parallel with the legitimate economy's stagnation, recognised the economic opportunity that the club's popularity represented. Drug dealing at the Haçienda moved from ad hoc and social to organised and territorial. By 1990 and 1991, The club store security had been effectively taken over by criminal operatives. The management was receiving threats, and the open, warm social atmosphere that had characterized the 1988 season was giving way to something harder and more anxious. The summer of 1988 remained, in the memories of the people who were present for it, a specific quality of moment, a particular combination of music and substance and social context that had not existed before and would not exist again in quite the same form. It did not last because the conditions that had created it were already being consumed by the consequences of their own success. But while it lasted, it was real. The morning after always came. But in the summer of 1988, for a few months, the night was very long. The Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994 was, in a direct sense, a legislative response to the rave scene, the first major piece of British legislation that defined a category of music as legally significant. Section 63 of the Act gave police the power to direct people to leave land in the vicinity of a rave, defined in the statute as a gathering of 100 or more people at which amplified music with sounds wholly or predominantly characterized by the emission of a succession of repetitive beats was played during the night hours. The phrase repetitive beats entered British statute law as a legal description of something that needed to be controlled. Parliament had criminalized a tempo. The DJ culture that the rave scene had produced went on to become the foundation of the British music industry's most commercially successful period, the 1990s explosion of electronic music, of labels like Warp and Ninja Tune and XL Recordings, of acts whose careers began on acid house dance floors and ended in mainstream chart positions. The generation of musicians, producers and promoters who came up through the rave scene of 1988 and 1989 shaped the sonic landscape of British popular music for the following 2 decades. The Haçienda itself closed in 1997, unable to sustain the combination of costs, crime and declining attendance that the early 1990s had produced. The building was later converted into apartments. The name remains in the collective memory of British popular culture, with a resonance that most nightclubs do not achieve even while operating. The wider history of Factory Records, Tony Wilson, and what Manchester produced in those years is a story this channel may return to in full. If there is a corner of cultural history you would like to sleep through, leave it in the comments. The photograph. On the evening of Saturday, November 11, 1995, a young woman named Leah celebrated her 18th birthday at her parents' house in Latchingdon, a village in Essex. Her father, Paul Betts, was a police officer. Her mother, Janet, was a school nurse. The party was ordinary in the ways that birthday parties for 18-year-olds are ordinary. Music, friends, the specific ritual of a birthday at the threshold of legal adulthood. At some point during the evening, Leah took a tablet of ecstasy. By most accounts, it was not the first time. She began to feel unwell some hours into the party and went to lie down. Her condition deteriorated quickly. By late evening, she was unconscious, and she was taken by ambulance to Broomfield Hospital in Chelmsford, where she was placed on life support. The medical team found that she was suffering from severe cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, caused by critically low blood sodium levels. Her prognosis was, from the first night, very poor. She remained on life support for 4 days, while her brain damage became irreversible. She died on November 16, 1995. She was 18 years old. She had been alive for 4 days after the party. Her parents, in the weeks following her death, made a decision that required a specific kind of courage and a specific kind of grief. They agreed to release a photograph taken during the 4 days she had spent on life support. Their daughter, lying in a hospital bed, unconscious, with tubes in her nose and mouth, her face swollen beyond easy recognition. They made this decision because they wanted people to understand what had happened, because they believed that understanding would prevent other deaths, because the abstraction of a news report was not the same as the fact of a face. The photograph ran on the front pages of virtually every British national newspaper. The coverage that followed treated Leah Betts's death as an ecstasy overdose. The word overdose appeared in headlines and captions with a frequency that reflected both genuine grief and a press culture's tendency toward the most available explanatory frame. She had taken ecstasy. She had died. The causal chain seemed self-evident. It was not accurate. The pathological investigation of Leah Betts's death established that the cause was hyponatremia, critically low blood sodium, produced by the consumption of approximately 7 liters of water in a period of roughly 90 minutes following her ecstasy tablet. She died not from too much MDMA, but from too much water. The mechanism is specific and worth understanding. MDMA has an antidiuretic effect. It causes the body to retain water by suppressing the hormone that would normally signal the kidneys to excrete it. In a person who has taken MDMA and then consumed very large quantities of water, the retained water dilutes the blood sodium concentration to the point where the cells of the brain following osmotic pressure absorb water and swell. The swelling in a closed skull produces catastrophic pressure. The outcome, in severe cases, is fatal. The harm reduction advice circulating in British clubbing culture in 1995 was responsible for Leah Betts drinking the quantity of water she did. That advice, drink water, drink plenty of water, stay hydrated, had been developed in response to earlier MDMA-related deaths from hypothermia, cases in which dancers had overheated in hot club environments without drinking enough fluid. The advice was correct as a response to the overheating deaths. It was fatally incomplete as a general instruction because it omitted the critical qualification that the relevant risk was dehydration, not thirst, and that the body's normal thirst signals were reliable guides to how much to drink, and that exceeding those signals significantly was itself dangerous. The harm reduction organisations that had been working in British clubbing culture since the early 1990s understood this. The organisation Lifeline in Manchester had been distributing MDMA information leaflets outside nightclubs for several years. And their materials, by 1995, had been revised to include guidance on water consumption that was more nuanced than the simple drink water message. But the more nuanced message had not reached Leah Betts at her birthday party in Latchington on November 11th. The poster campaign that the Betts family sanctioned in the weeks following her death became one of the most widely reproduced pieces of British drug warning imagery of the decade. The text was simple and declarative. Sorted, just 1 ecstasy tablet killed Leah Betts. The posters appeared across Britain, in schools, on buses, in tube stations, in shop windows. The campaign reached a population that had not been reached by harm reduction messaging and delivered a message that was, in its central causal claim, not accurate. It said 1 tablet killed her. The tablet was not what had killed her. In the climate that the poster campaign created, correcting this inaccuracy was effectively impossible. To say publicly that Leah Betts had not died of an MDMA overdose was to appear to be defending the drug, and defending the drug was to appear to be indifferent to the death of an 18-year-old girl whose face was on the front page of every newspaper in the country. The harm reduction organisations that held accurate information faced a public environment in which the accurate information could not be communicated without being heard as a political statement rather than a medical one. A 15-year-old girl named Anna Wood died in Sydney, Australia on October 26, 1995, 2 weeks before Leah Betts's death, and under circumstances that were nearly identical. Anna had taken ecstasy at a rave and had subsequently consumed very large quantities of water. She died of hyponatremia. Australian press coverage of her death, like the British coverage that would follow 2 weeks later, described the cause as MDMA toxicity. The coincidence of the 2 deaths, so close together and so similar in circumstance, reinforced the narrative on 2 continents. The policy responses in Britain following November 1995 were immediate and, in several cases, counterproductive from a harm reduction perspective. Nightclub licensing conditions in multiple local authorities were tightened, with requirements for water availability being introduced alongside new restrictions on who could obtain late-night licenses. These were, in theory, harm reduction measures. In practice, they were introduced in a political climate that made genuine harm reduction, the kind that acknowledged the pharmacology accurately and gave people information that would actually reduce risk. Impossible to advocate for publicly without facing accusations of condoning drug use. The inquest into Leah Betts's death, held in 1996, reached the conclusion that the medical evidence supported she had died from water intoxication. The inquest verdict was covered by the British press significantly less prominently than the original death had been. The poster remained. The understanding of how she had actually died did not reach the same audience that the initial coverage had. What the 1995 cases left behind was a public discourse around MDMA that had been organized around fear and inaccuracy at a moment when both the drug's availability and its use were at historic highs. The people who had information that could have reduced harm were working in a landscape where providing that information was itself politically hazardous. And the compound was still being taken on Friday and Saturday nights across Britain by people whose knowledge of what they were doing was worse than it had been before the coverage made the subject impossible to discuss honestly. The photograph did its work. The policy followed the photograph. And the gap between what was true about MDMA and what the public was told about it grew wider in the years following Leah Betts's death than it had been before. The harm reduction movement in Britain had been developing throughout the early 1990s in direct response to the rave scene's scale. Organisations including Lifeline in Manchester, the Liverpool Drug Dependency Unit, and the non-profit Release in London had been working since at least 1991 to distribute accurate, evidence-based information about MDMA to the people who were using it in clubs and at outdoor events. Their materials were pragmatic. They did not recommend abstinence as the primary message because the audience for whom the materials were produced was already using the drug and wanted information about doing so with reduced risk. This pragmatism was unusual in the British drug education landscape of the era, and it was both their strength and, in the political climate after November 1995, their vulnerability. The government's response to the Leah Betts case included a specific effort to review harm reduction materials and assess whether they constituted implicit endorsement of drug use. Several local authorities that had previously tolerated or quietly supported harm reduction distribution outside nightclubs became significantly more cautious. The Drug Advisory Service, a government-funded body, produced guidance that prioritized abstinence messaging over the kind of practical risk information that harm reduction workers had been finding effective. The shift was political rather than epidemiological. It was a response to tabloid pressure and to a specific case whose medical details the press had not accurately reported, not to evidence that abstinence messaging reduced MDMA-related harm. Nicholas Saunders, a British researcher and author who had published the first widely circulated English-language book on MDMA in 1993, had been distributing it free of charge outside British nightclubs as a harm reduction measure since publication. The book included specific, accurate information about water consumption, body temperature management, and MDMA interactions with other substances. In the months following Leah Betts's death, distributing this material outside clubs became significantly more difficult, not because the information was wrong, but because the political atmosphere made the activity look like endorsement of the drug that had been splashed across every British newspaper. The decade that followed November 1995 saw MDMA use in Britain continue at high levels, with the compound remaining one of the most widely used illicit substances in the country, while the public health conversation about it remained organised around the emotional register of the Leah Betts poster, rather than the pharmacological register that would have made accurate risk communication possible. The harm reduction organisations that held accurate information continued their work, but in a constrained environment that made them cautious about what they said publicly. The result was a population of MDMA users whose access to accurate risk information was worse than it had been in 1994. Paul and Janet Betts, in the years following their daughter's death, became vocal advocates against drug use in schools and communities. Their advocacy was sincere, motivated by genuine grief, and based on the understanding of their daughter's death that the initial press coverage had provided. The family's campaign was taken seriously precisely because the grief was real. The medical inaccuracy at the center of the campaign's central message, "Just one ecstasy tablet killed Leah Betts," was not something that anyone in a position of institutional authority found it comfortable to address publicly. It would have required saying, to a grieving family, that the story they were telling was not quite the story of what had happened. No politician was prepared to do this. No public health official did. The poster remained. The reporting that shaped public understanding of MDMA for a generation was built on a medical inaccuracy that was barely corrected. Subscribe if this kind of forensic history is what you come here for. What the molecule does. The pharmacology of MDMA is, in certain ways, more surprising than its social history, and understanding it explains why the social history took the shape it did. MDMA belongs to the phenethylamine family, the same broad molecular class that includes dopamine, adrenaline, mescaline, and the amphetamines. Its structural relationship to amphetamine is legible in the name that chemistry eventually assigned it. Methylenedioxymethamphetamine. The methamphetamine in the name indicates a stimulant backbone. The molecule shares enough structure with methamphetamine that it produces some stimulant effects. Heart rate increases, body temperature rises, appetite is suppressed. These are the effects you would predict from the structure, and they are present. What you would not predict from the structure alone, and what distinguishes MDMA from the stimulants whose architecture it shares, is the serotonin surge. MDMA is a powerful releaser of serotonin, far more so than dopamine or norepinephrine, which it also releases, but to a considerably lesser degree. The disproportion matters. Cocaine and methamphetamine produce their most powerful effects through dopamine, specifically through the dopamine reward circuits in the striatum, the mesolimbic system, the nucleus accumbens. Dopamine in these circuits is the neurotransmitter of wanting. It produces motivation, anticipation, the urgent sense that something good is about to happen and must be pursued. When dopamine is released at very high levels by cocaine or methamphetamine, the result is an intense euphoria, followed by a depletion that makes the absence of the drug feel like a deprivation, which is the basic mechanism of compulsive redosing and addiction. MDMA's primary effect is serotonin, and serotonin is different. Serotonin is not primarily a reward molecule. Its role in the nervous system is complex. It is involved in mood regulation, in sleep, in appetite, in social behavior, in the modulation of pain, but its primary subjective effect, when released in large quantities by MDMA, is not euphoria in the cocaine sense. It is something closer to contentment, warmth, a sense that everything is at this moment acceptable, that the things that normally produce anxiety or defensive reaction have become, without changing in themselves, manageable. The oxytocin component adds a further dimension that is specifically relevant to the therapeutic applications. Oxytocin is synthesized in the hypothalamus and released by the pituitary, and it plays a documented role in social bonding, in the formation of trust, and in the modulation of the amygdala, the brain region responsible for processing threat and initiating the fear response. Studies suggest that MDMA triggers a significant release of oxytocin, and that this release is partly responsible for the reduction of threat response activity in the amygdala that the compound produces. In practical terms, the situations, memories, and interpersonal dynamics that would normally trigger the amygdala's alarm system continue to be processed. The compound does not remove them from consciousness, but they are processed with the alarm system turned down. This is the neurological explanation for what Leo Zeff observed clinically in the late 1970s. Patients could approach material that normally triggered overwhelming fear because the fear circuit was temporarily less reactive. The norepinephrine component explains the experience of the come-up period that MDMA users consistently describe, the 20 to 40 minutes between ingestion and the onset of the primary serotonergic effects. Norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter of the body's alerting response. When MDMA begins to act, The norepinephrine surge arrives before the serotonin surge, producing a brief but clear activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Heart rate increases noticeably. Jaw tension is common. Some people experience anxiety, nausea, or a heightened sense of arousal that is more uncomfortable than pleasant. This period was documented in the earliest clinical reports from the Zeph network, and preparing patients for it was considered an essential part of the therapeutic protocol. The come-up resolved as the serotonin effects took hold, and this resolution was typically experienced as a clear and rapid change in the emotional weather. The neurotoxicity question occupied the scientific literature from the late 1980s onward, and it is worth being precise about what the evidence actually shows rather than what was reported about it in the popular press. The concern emerged from animal studies conducted in the late 1980s, primarily by George Ricorte's laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. These studies administered MDMA to non-human primates, rhesus monkeys, squirrel monkeys, and found evidence in post-mortem analysis of damage to serotonin-producing axons in the cortex and hippocampus. The terminals of the serotonin neurons that projected from the RAF nuclei into the forebrain were reduced in number in animals that had received MDMA. The studies attracted significant attention and were cited extensively by the DEA and in anti-MDMA public health campaigns. The methodological complications were less prominently reported. The doses used in the animal studies were substantially higher than the doses that human recreational users typically consumed, in body weight adjusted terms, by factors of 2 to 4 or more in some protocols. The dosing schedules, multiple administrations per day, repeated across several days, did not correspond to typical human patterns of use. The relevance of non-human primate findings to human neurophysiology was assumed rather than demonstrated, and the studies examined the serotonin systems of animals that had been given very large quantities of the compound by weight, not the nervous systems of people who had taken 80 to 120 milligrams at a party once a month. The retraction of one of the most alarming studies in the literature is a story that did not receive the attention it warranted. In 2002, Ricorte's laboratory published a paper in the journal Science reporting that even a single recreational dose of MDMA could produce Parkinson's-like brain damage to the dopaminergic neurons of the substantia nigra, the region whose degeneration causes Parkinson's disease. The finding was alarming enough to receive extensive press coverage. It was cited in political arguments against MDMA research. The study was retracted a year later, in 2003, after it emerged that the animals in the experiment had been administered methamphetamine, not MDMA. The bottles had been mislabeled in the supplier's facility. The DEA's scientific apparatus, which had been aware of the study and had cited it, had not caught the error before publication. The retraction was reported significantly less prominently than the original finding. The claim that a single dose of MDMA could cause Parkinson's-like damage remained in the public understanding of the drug long after it had been removed from the scientific record. What the imaging studies of heavy MDMA users, people who had used the compound dozens or hundreds of times over periods of years, at quantities that dwarfed what clinical trials would ever use, do show is some reduction in serotonin transporter density in certain brain regions and some associated effects on memory performance, particularly verbal memory. These findings are real and warrant caution about heavy recreational use. They do not translate directly into what happens to someone who receives MDMA 2 or 3 times in a controlled clinical setting with trained therapists over a course of treatment. The dose, the frequency, and the context are different in ways that are not incidental. The temperature regulation issue deserves separate attention. MDMA raises body temperature through a combination of increased metabolic rate, peripheral vasoconstriction, and direct effects on the hypothalamic temperature regulation system. In combination with vigorous physical activity, dancing specifically, in a hot, enclosed environment, this elevation can become dangerous. The early deaths that drove the British harm reduction conversation of the early 1990s were primarily hypothermia deaths, people who had danced intensively in hot clubs without adequate cooling or fluid intake. The solution to hypothermia deaths was environmental: adequate ventilation, temperature management, access to water and to cooling. and it was the appropriate application of this solution that produced the incomplete water hydration advice that contributed to the hyponatremia deaths that followed. MDMA also carries interaction risks that distinguish it from many other recreational compounds. In combination with monoamine oxidase inhibitors, a class of antidepressants used for treatment-resistant depression, MDMA can produce serotonin syndrome, a potentially life-threatening excess of serotonergic activity. The interaction is not hypothetical. People have died from it in cases that combined MDMA with prescribed medications whose interactions with recreational substances were not prominently disclosed. The risk was documented. The information was not well distributed. What the neuroscience, taken in full, describes is a compound of unusual pharmacological specificity, one that does something to the nervous system that no other well-characterized compound does in quite the same way, at the same level of selectivity. The serotonin surge without a commensurate dopamine surge. The oxytocin release and amygdala modulation. The temporary reduction of threat reactivity while maintaining cognitive clarity. These are properties that explain with considerable precision both the therapeutic applications that the clinical underground discovered and the social experiences that Ibiza and the Haçienda produced. The molecule was doing what it did. The question was always what setting that doing would happen in. The setting, it turned out, determined almost everything. The MDMA experience's sensitivity to context, what psychedelic researchers call set and setting, terms that Albert Hofmann and Timothy Leary both used and that remain the most useful shorthand for the phenomenon, is more pronounced with MDMA than with most other psychoactive compounds. A person who takes cocaine in an unpleasant environment has roughly the same pharmacological experience as a person who takes cocaine in a pleasant one, because cocaine's primary mechanism, dopamine in the reward circuits, is not significantly modulated by expectation, trust, or interpersonal safety. MDMA's primary mechanism, serotonin, oxytocin, amygdala modulation, is profoundly modulated by these factors. A person who takes MDMA in a setting that triggers anxiety or threat will likely find the compound's effects shaped by that anxiety. A person who takes it in a setting of safety, trust, and positive expectation will find the oxytocin and serotonin effects dominant. This is not placebo. It is pharmacology interacting with the specific neural circuits that MDMA most powerfully targets. The duration of MDMA's effects, 4 to 5 hours for the main pharmacological action, with a gradual resolution over the subsequent several hours, is itself a pharmacological characteristic that distinguishes it from most other psychoactive compounds used recreationally. Alcohol's effects resolve relatively quickly. Cocaine's effects last 30 to 45 minutes per dose. MDMA's sustained activity window was the reason that therapy sessions needed to be 8 hours long, and also the reason that MDMA-related harm at outdoor events was linked to sustained exertion over many hours, rather than a brief acute exposure. The compound stays. Whatever the setting provides, the compound stays in it. One dimension of MDMA's pharmacology that the popular discussion largely missed was the question of tolerance. Unlike opioids, which produce tolerance within days of regular use, or benzodiazepines, which produce tolerance within weeks, MDMA produces a very specific and pronounced acute tolerance. A second dose taken within a few hours of the first produces markedly diminished effects. The therapeutic protocol developed by MAPS, with sessions spaced approximately 1 month apart, was calibrated to this pharmacological characteristic. Recreational users who redosed at shortened intervals reported progressively diminishing effects. The compound did not lend itself to the kind of daily or near-daily use that drove addiction in other drug categories. This was one reason that the research literature consistently found lower rates of dependence associated with MDMA than with cocaine, heroin, alcohol, or even cannabis. The pharmacology of MDMA sits outside the usual categories in ways that took researchers decades to articulate. What piece of the neuroscience surprised you most tonight? Leave it in the comments. I read them all. The long-return Rick Doblin spent the 1990s doing what he had promised himself he would do in 1986, in circumstances that made the task considerably harder than it had been when he made the promise. The 1990s were not a favorable decade for psychedelic research. The moral panic that had been building around ecstasy since the late 1980s had created a political climate in which any research associated with MDMA required not only scientific justification, but a level of political courage that most institutions were not prepared to extend. The NIH did not fund such research. Major pharmaceutical companies had no commercial interest in a compound that could not be patented. The Merck patent had expired decades earlier, and whose therapeutic model, involving 8-hour sessions with trained guides, was incompatible with the kind of scalable, prescribable product that the pharmaceutical industry was built to produce and profit from. Academic medical centers received their research funding from institutions that reviewed applications in a climate shaped by the DEA's scheduling decision and the tabloid coverage of the rave scene. MAPS operated in this landscape with the organizational resources of a small non-profit, and the conviction of an organization that believed it was simply correct. Doblin completed his doctorate at Harvard's Kennedy School in 2000, with a dissertation on the regulation of psychedelic research. The dissertation documented in careful, institutional language what had happened to MDMA research and proposed a pathway for its resumption. It was read by a small number of people outside the academic context and had no immediate policy effect. It was also a demonstration of the methodological seriousness with which MAPS intended to conduct its work, a seriousness designed to make the research impossible to dismiss on procedural grounds. The scientific context for PTSD research had changed considerably in the decade since MDMA had been scheduled. Brain imaging technology had advanced to the point where the neurological signature of PTSD could be directly observed. The hyperactivated amygdala, the underactivated prefrontal cortex, the disrupted hippocampal memory processing that characterized the condition's neurobiology. This imaging made it possible to see what PTSD did to the brain, rather than simply observing its behavioral effects. And it made it possible to ask with new precision what a therapeutic intervention needed to do neurobiologically to address the underlying pathology, rather than just managing the symptoms. The answer that the neuroscience suggested was, in broad terms, an intervention that temporarily reduced amygdala reactivity, while allowing the prefrontal cortex to engage with traumatic material in a way that normal PTSD symptomatology prevented. The existing pharmacological treatments, primarily SSRIs, addressed the serotonin system but did not produce the temporary, profound reduction of fear circuit reactivity that would allow the memory processing to occur. Exposure-based therapies, deliberately confronting traumatic memories in controlled settings, worked for some patients and re-traumatized others. The gap that the neuroscience was identifying was, in very precise terms, the gap that the underground therapists of the Zeph network had been filling for a decade before MDMA was scheduled. MAPS obtained DEA approval to conduct a Phase 1 safety study of MDMA in the late 1990s, a process that required navigating a regulatory relationship between the organization and the agency that had prohibited the compound it was studying. The study was small, 8 participants, and produced no significant adverse events. It established that MDMA at therapeutic doses could be administered to human subjects in a controlled setting without the harms that the DEA's scheduling decision had implied were associated with any use of the compound. The finding was not surprising to anyone familiar with the clinical literature, but it was the kind of evidence that the regulatory system required before it would consider the next step. The Phase 2 trials, conducted through the 2000s and into the 2010s, enrolled patients with chronic, treatment-resistant PTSD, people who had completed other available therapies without achieving sustained improvement, who had been living with the condition for a minimum of 3 years in most protocols, some for much longer. The therapeutic format that MAPS had developed drew on the protocols of the Zeph Underground, but had been formalized in ways that met clinical trial standards. 2 therapists per session, 1 male, 1 female in most cases, extensive preparation sessions conducted without the compound, 3 MDMA sessions spaced approximately 1 month apart, and integration sessions after each MDMA session in which the material that had emerged was processed in conventional therapeutic conversation. The sessions themselves lasted 8 hours, not because 8 hours was a round number, but because the compound's pharmacological action lasted approximately 4 to 5 hours, and the therapeutic work that followed the active phase, the processing, the consolidation, the beginning of the integration that would continue in subsequent conventional sessions, required the remainder. 8 hours is a working day. The therapeutic model MAPS was developing was not a treatment that could be scaled into a 15-minute prescription appointment. It required time, attention, and 2 trained human beings present for the duration. This was also, in the view of the researchers, why it worked. The Phase 2 results, published across several peer-reviewed papers between 2010 and 2018, produced a consistent signal. In the trials conducted by Michael Mithufa and his colleagues in South Carolina, the most extensively documented of the Phase 2 studies, the primary outcome measure was change in PTSD symptom scores, as measured by the clinician-administered PTSD scale. Participants who received MDMA-assisted therapy showed symptom reductions that were substantially larger than those in the placebo group. In the most widely cited result from the Phase 2 program, approximately 68% of participants who had received MDMA-assisted therapy no longer met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD at the primary endpoint, compared to approximately 32% of participants who had received inactive placebo. The difference was not a marginal effect. It was the most robust signal that had been seen in a PTSD clinical trial in years. The FDA granted MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD its breakthrough therapy designation in August of 2017. The designation was not an approval. It was a formal acknowledgement by the agency whose predecessor had not challenged the DEA's 1986 scheduling decision that the existing evidence warranted expedited development and review. The FDA committed to working closely with MAPS through the Phase 3 process, providing guidance that would be more rapid and more collaborative than the standard review timeline. The designation was the first time the FDA had ever awarded this status to a therapy involving a Schedule Y substance. The Phase 3 trials enrolled 90 participants at sites across the United States, Canada, and Israel. The design was a rigorous randomized controlled trial with a blinded therapist rater outcome assessment, addressing the methodological limitation that blinding was inherently difficult in a trial where one group received an active psychoactive compound and the other received a placebo. The results published in Nature Medicine in 2021 were consistent with what Phase 2 had found. Approximately 67% of participants in the MDMA group no longer met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD at the primary endpoint, compared to approximately 32% in the placebo group. The effect size was large by any reasonable standard of clinical significance. The adverse event profile was manageable and included no new safety signals. Among the participants in the Phase 3 trials were a significant number of military veterans, people whose PTSD had been treatment-resistant for years or decades, who had been through multiple courses of standard of care therapy without sustained improvement. Their outcomes were not reported separately from the larger group, but veterans organizations that had been following the research with cautious interest began, after the Phase 3 data became public, to move from caution toward active support. Several prominent retired military officers and members of Congress publicly endorsed continued research and regulatory action. International developments moved alongside the American regulatory process. Canada approved expanded access to MDMA-assisted therapy for treatment-resistant PTSD in 2021, allowing patients to receive the treatment through compassionate access programs while the full regulatory process continued. Australia went further. In February 2023, the Therapeutic Goods Administration announced that MDMA would be rescheduled to permit its use in MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, under the supervision of authorized psychiatrists, making Australia the first country in the world to create a formal regulatory pathway for clinical MDMA use. The announcement was modest in scale. The number of authorized psychiatrists was small. The patient population that could be reached was limited, but the precedent was significant. In the United States, the FDA's advisory committee reviewed the MAPS application for MDMA-assisted therapy in June of 2024. The committee's vote was mixed. A majority found the evidence for efficacy sufficient, but expressed concerns about trial design and the management of functional unblinding. The FDA subsequently issued a complete response letter requesting additional data. The regulatory path became longer than MAPS had hoped, but the underlying scientific case, which the advisory committee did not dispute, remained intact. The compound had been shown, in controlled conditions, to do what the underground therapists had reported it doing in the 1970s and 1980s. The therapists who had worked in the Zeph network, the few who were still alive, and the many who had since died of natural causes at ages that their therapeutic work had not prevented, watched from varying distances. Most had never been prosecuted. Most had never been named publicly. They had conducted thousands of sessions over many years, kept no records that could be subpoenaed, and carried what they knew in the professional equivalent of long memory. What the Phase 3 data was demonstrating, in the statistical language that regulatory systems required, was what they had observed in clinical practice 40 years earlier. They had been right. Not lucky, not naively optimistic, not professionally reckless. Right about a compound and a process, and a population of patients for whom the alternatives were not working. The evidence had taken 30 years to produce in the form that institutions would accept. In the quiet of the therapy rooms where it had all begun, the molecule had been doing the same thing all along. The history of LSD, its serious research era, in the 1950s and 1960s, its suppression, and its long, slow return to clinical study, follows a pattern that runs very close to MDMA's. That story is on this channel. What the records remember. At the end of a long story, there is always the question of what the story was about. The story of MDMA is not, at its center, a story about drugs. The drugs are present throughout. In the Darmstadt laboratory in 1912, in Leo Zeff's Oakland practice in 1978, at Amnesia in 1987, in the Phase 3 trials in 2021, but the molecule is only the occasion for the human activity that surrounds it. The story is about how societies manage knowledge that doesn't fit the categories they've already built. About what happens when something useful exists in a form that the institutions of usefulness cannot accommodate. About the gap between what evidence shows and what policy does with the evidence. The gap in MDMA's case was wide and long. A compound that 60-year-old clinical observation suggested was effective for treating severe, treatment-resistant psychiatric conditions was placed in the most restrictive category of American drug law, a category defined by the absence of accepted medical use, and kept there for nearly 4 decades, while the evidence for its medical use accumulated in underground clinical practice, in foreign research, and eventually in the formal trial system that the scheduling had made nearly impossible to operate. The gap was not created by malice or conspiracy. It was created by the interaction of a scheduling mechanism that treated a molecule as essentially a permanent classification rather than a provisional one, a political climate that made revision of that classification nearly impossible, and a research infrastructure that depended on institutional goodwill that the scheduling decision had made unavailable. Leo Zeff died in 1988, 2 years after the compound he had trained thousands of therapists to use was classified as having no medical use. He did not live to see the Phase 2 results. He did not live to see the breakthrough therapy designation. He did not live to see Australia become the first country to formally permit clinical MDMA use. He died knowing that the work he had done was real, that the patients he had seen were better, and that the institutional world had decided that his evidence did not qualify as evidence. The rave culture that the compound produced in Britain in 1988 and 1989 is remembered now through a particular quality of nostalgia that belongs to that specific period. The second summer of love, the Haçienda, the M25 raves, the smiley face. These images carry, for the people who were present, a sense of something that was real and particular and unrepeatable, a social experience that the combination of a specific molecule, a specific music, and a specific historical moment produced, and that could not be reconstructed after the conditions that had created it changed. That this experience was intertwined with illegality, with some degree of harm, with the intervention of organized crime, and tabloid panic and political reaction. None of this diminishes its reality. It simply places it in the full context it belongs to. The Texas entrepreneurs who named the compound ecstasy and sold it from a telephone line believed, as far as the historical record shows, that they were doing something valuable. They were wrong about the consequence, if not the intention. The visibility that commercial distribution created was the visibility that triggered the scheduling response that ended the therapeutic work that they did not know was happening. The naming of ecstasy is, in the history of MDMA, the turning point that looks most like a tragedy in retrospect, not because the name was wrong for what they were selling, but because of what the name made visible at a moment when visibility was precisely what the therapeutic network had been working to avoid. Rick Doblin spent 35 years trying to repair the consequence of that visibility, to bring the evidence through the institutional systems that had not been designed to handle it, to produce the numbers that a regulatory agency required, to hold the organization together through decades of limited funding and public skepticism. The record of what he built is now a scientific literature, a Phase 3 dataset, and a regulatory process that is, whatever its outcome, more serious than anything that existed in 1986 when he made the decision to begin. The molecular history is also worth sitting with. A compound synthesized as a byproduct of a search for a blood-clotting agent in a Darmstadt laboratory in 1912 was granted a patent that sat in the chemical literature for 60 years. It was studied by the US Army in a classified program in 1953 and set aside as insufficiently interesting. It was rediscovered by an organic chemist working alone in a California garden shed in 1976 and shared with a Jungian therapist who came out of retirement to use it. It spread through an underground therapeutic network, was commercialized under a different name, was emergency scheduled, was fought over in legal hearings where a government judge recommended against scheduling, and was overruled, appeared in warehouses in Manchester and on dance floors in Ibiza, was linked in the public mind to the death of a young woman who had actually died of water, and was studied in controlled trials for 30 years, until the evidence became too large to dismiss. This is the life of a molecule, longer than most human lives, and shaped by forces that no one who was present at any particular moment in it could see whole. The Darmstadt chemist did not know what he had made. Shulgin knew what he had found, but not what it would become. Zeph knew it was useful and could not protect it. The Texas distributors knew it sold, but not what they were selling. The ravers in the Haçienda knew only that Friday night was different now, and the veterans in the Phase 3 trials knew, after 3 sessions in a room with 2 trained therapists, that something had shifted in them, that years of prior treatment had not been able to shift. What the records remember is all of this: the patent, the classified report, the notebooks, the therapy session transcripts that were mostly never written, the court testimony, the scheduling documents, the retracted paper, the Phase 3 dataset. The records do not resolve the history into a clean lesson. They hold it open, the way the history itself stays open, in the ongoing regulatory conversations, the ongoing research programs, the ongoing lives of the people whom the compound touched in every form it took. The night is long. The records keep their own time. You have been through the whole of it tonight, from Darmstadt in 1912 to a Phase 3 trial site in the 21st century. Subscribe before you sleep. There is more history waiting. And so the story settles, the way all long stories settle, into the particular weight of what it leaves behind. Somewhere in Oakland in 1977, a man who had been tired and retired and done sat in a chair and felt, through the effect of a compound he had not known about until a few weeks prior, something he had not expected to feel. He was 67 years old. He sat quietly with the feeling, the way that people who are experienced at sitting quietly with feelings do. and he thought about his patients. He thought about the people he had been unable to help as fully as he had wished. He thought about what was possible that had not been possible before. He did not write about this decision in his journals. He made the decision and went to work the following morning and did not look back. Somewhere in Dallas in 1982, a group of people chose a word for a feeling that had not had one, and the word was not quite right. But it was close enough to work, and it worked enormously well. They could not have known what the word would set in motion. They knew only that the evening was good, and the business was growing, and the phone was ringing with orders from cities they had not yet thought to target. Somewhere in Ibiza, in the late summer of 1987, 4 men from London heard music they already knew, in a way they had never heard it before, in an open-air room in the hills above a quiet town, with the trees lit and the night warm and something moving through them that they did not have words for on the way home. They came back and tried to make the same thing happen in London, which is a different city in a different light. They mostly succeeded. The light was not the same, but the feeling was close enough. Somewhere in a trial site, in the first decade of the 21st century, a veteran who had not slept without nightmares in 12 years sat across from 2 people he had spent 3 months learning to trust, and took a capsule and waited. The onset took 40 minutes. The session lasted 8 hours. At the end of it, he went home. He did not know yet whether it had worked. The follow-up assessment 3 months later would tell him that he no longer met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. He would not know quite what to do with that information at first. Then, slowly, he would begin to find out. Let the story rest now. You have carried it a long way tonight, through a German laboratory and an Oakland therapy room, and a Dallas bar, and an Ibiza hillside, and a Manchester warehouse, and a federal courtroom. And back, finally, to the quiet place where clinical evidence sits in filing cabinets, waiting for the regulatory calendar to turn. You do not need to hold all of it. You only needed to pass through it. The night is already far along. Your breath has slowed. The details are softening at the edges, the specific dates and names becoming less distinct, the feeling of the story remaining when the content has begun to dissolve. This is how history settles into you, not as a set of facts to be retrieved, but as a shape, a weight, a sense of what happened and why. Sleep now. The molecule is still doing its work, in research labs and clinical offices and regulatory hearings, in ways that do not require your attention tonight. The long argument about what a compound is permitted to do in a human nervous system continues in rooms you do not need to be in. You have been through the history. You know what it contains. If you enjoyed this story, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if there's a substance or chapter of history you'd like me to cover next, leave it in the comments below.